Welcome to another edition of the Trees and Lines podcast. Today we welcome back Beth Lay, Director Safety and Human Performance at Lewis Tree Services, and Chris Paglia, VP Safety, Health, and Environmental at a very large electric utility in the Northeast. Tej and I will be speaking with Chris and Beth to hear about the safety challenges and lessons learned as these two companies together faced a once-in-a-generation storm. So please listen to what I think you will find to be a fascinating conversation.
Welcome to another episode of Trees and Lines. We have an old friend joining us in Beth Lay from Lewis. Welcome, Beth. And a new guest, Chris Paglia. Chris, I hope I'm saying your last name correctly, who is a Vice President of Safety, Health, and Assurance for a large Northeast utility. Offline, I already poked Chris on the Celtics losing in Game 7, so I'm not going to try to do it in the recording.
Many thanks.
Yeah, exactly. But today's going to be a pretty interesting episode, and it's going to be something a little bit different. I believe both Chris and Beth at one point were kind of dealing with an event, in the market that was kind of affecting a part of the Northeast. And so they had a lot of sort of exposure to something that they're going to share with us today, possibly some lessons learned, how to approach emergency related events. And we also want to kind of dig into Chris's background a little bit, as he is sort of a senior person in industry and safety, of course, being such an important topic for the entire utility and industrial space. But it's always something that I think people have their hard times getting their arms around. So would love to sort of, get Chris's take on the diagnostic view of safety. So enough from me, sorry, folks. So welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah, awesome. Phil, what do you think? We just want to dive right in?
Yeah, let's dive in. Let's ask Chris and Beth again to give us a little introduction on them, and then let's talk about this event from last year.
Yeah, of course.
Chris, you give us a little background?
Sure. So Chris Paglia, I've been in the utility industry about 18 years, and in such, I've had the opportunity to change my roles a number of different times, working in customer and finance and operations and emergency management, now safety. And so in those different roles, I've come to understand a lot of the uniqueness, I guess, that we have as a utility industry. And one of the things that I have found that's, I think, quite unique is the amount of sharing and learning that we do with peer utilities, but also how I got to meet Beth. And as someone working in line clearance, I got to meet Beth, and some of our background is similar. And we got the opportunity to partner recently on a presentation around a storm event. And so, Beth, maybe I'll hand it to you there.
Sure. And so maybe I'll just expand a little bit on what you said about our background being similar. Chris and I were on a video call, and I noticed a book on the bookshelf that you see behind him right now on resilience engineering. And, from the last podcast, we talked some about what that is, and that's my background. So I'm the director of resilience and reliability at Lewis. And if it's okay with you, I'll give you a little background on how this all came together.
Sure. Absolutely.
So Chris and I found ourselves at a human performance conference in January, and it was just after Winter Storm Elliott had hit Buffalo over Christmas. And it was somewhat serendipitous, I think, that we found ourselves together, because I had just heard the story from our frontline workers of their experiences during that storm, which were shocking, to put it mildly. So we began to talk about their experiences, the experience that Chris and his team had, and what we might do about it. So that kind of kicked off this whole, our whole conversations about it and what we've been working on together.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Tell us a little bit about the event, because it wasn't just a snowstorm, right? It was more than that.
Yeah. And, it might be interesting, because I think one of the things that the value of us working together on it is hearing the story from different perspectives. Then you get a more complete vision of what happened. So, Chris, I'm going to defer to you, if that's okay, to tell your version of the storm.
Yeah. So I think that at Christmas time, it was something like 75% of the United States was under some kind of winter storm warning. So no matter where you were probably preparing for or aware of significant weather that was coming across the whole of the U.S. And so I apologize if you have some jingling in the background. It's my dog with his bell.
I love it.
So we prepare. Utilities in general are prepared for all types of emergency events, but so winter storm comes along, and we began preparing for an event that was going to hit the entire Northeast, with a nor'easter, and that's exactly what got delivered. Was a very significant snow event that went right through the holidays. And that's always the other consideration, is not just, what are we going to get hit for with weather, but what's the timing and impacts to customers.
And for us, our operations span from Texas all the way to the Northeast. So basically, all across the U.S. And as this storm was coming in, we started getting calls for crews. And all in all, at one point in time, we were supporting more than 20 customers with crews for storm, and that's highly unusual. And so, as it started getting close to Buffalo, we were really worried about having enough leadership, since the storm was going to run into the holidays. That was one of our main concerns. It turned out that wasn't the problem for us at all, though.
I remember waking up that morning. So I'm in Massachusetts, and when I woke up that morning, my outdoor thermometer read 20 below.
Wow.
And I saw news reports that it was down to 70 below, with wind chills in some areas in New York.
It's amazing. So what were these shocking experiences?
Well, I think one of the things that, as the storm was coming up, there were different predictions of how bad it was going to be. And there was one newscast that's really stood out for me that said, "Watch out for those holiday inflatables." And then there were others newscasts that were saying this is going to be really bad. So you had a pretty wide divergence in people's predictions of how bad the storm was going to be. And so we got through the storm, and we got through it, and we got through it really well. No injuries. And I actually went out to interview some of our workers to ask them, what did we do that enabled us to do so well on the storm? And it was part of those interviews that the real situation, the tough situation that our frontline workers who were out there faced showed up. And we actually we've created kind of a cool video of us telling their story. But just to give you a couple of examples, at one point they were still deployed, right? They're still out there. They're parked in their trucks. And at one point, the snow was coming down so hard they couldn't see across the street. But I think what really struck me when they said our trucks couldn't keep up. And what they meant by that is, imagine this: the trucks are running, full bore, right? And you're sitting there and you're watching your fuel gauge go down, and your windows were starting to frost up on the inside. So the trucks could not keep up and keep the cab warm. It got that cold.
Wow.
That temperature, strange things start to happen. Like diesel starts to gel up, it can become gummy. And so, those types of things that we wouldn't normally experience in the lower 48 here. Maybe they're more familiar with them, further up north.
Yeah. Well, I'm from Toronto, so that event just confirmed for me that the move to Texas was a good one. I'm always interested in like lessons learned, right? So, what you guys saw, how you prepared for it. And it sounds like, the collective did an excellent job navigating a pretty complex situation. Chris, maybe you can kind of shed, by looking at that event and preparing for what may come, in the future, what would you guys do differently to set up your teams to prepare for, all the things that are necessary to kind of work through something like that?
So in emergency management, we generally follow, there's pre-planning, mobilization, restoration, and then lessons learned. So most utilities, I would say, follow that emergency management type cycle. And so when we're in, post event or even blue sky days, we're looking to see, look at what can we do to learn and improve. And I think one of the things that came out clearly, in meeting with Beth is how do we and they and vendors partner better together to understand, here's what our expectations are, right? So we know within the utility, here's what we're preparing for and our capabilities internally. And then similarly, do we know that our vendors have the same types of capabilities? Are they exercising or preparing in the same way? And having those relationships in advance to be able to confirm that, what we're receiving is fit for purpose, and it'll be able to be resilient enough to work through whatever surprises that they may encounter.
The other thing that we talked about, which I'm excited about, is after the event, you typically do an after action review, and we do after action reviews as well. And we've talked about joining and doing a joint after action review after the event.
I think that's great. And that's definitely something that, because you have so many stakeholders, I think the coordination, the quarterbacking in advance seems like a great thing to kind of prepare for in the future. Here's maybe this is a slight detour, but just a quick question on this. Given that, Chris, and you framed it, because this event was hitting the U.S. or expecting to hit the most of the U.S., right? And so all of your neighboring states, was there, did you guys run into a bit of a labor shortage, or was it like a fighting for resources to kind of solve your localized problem? Or did you guys already in advance have like a queue lined up?
So in advance, in that pre-planning stage, we're looking at the weather and trying to understand where those impacts going to be and what resources are we going to need, what do we already have, and where do we need to supplement. And another great thing about the industry, and I mentioned the sharing, there's already mechanisms for companies to share crews. They call it mutual assistance from one utility to the next. And that can be, that starts before an event happens. And then during an event, the same thing continues. And so use the word fighting. It's not really fighting. It's, where is the most need and how do we partner to make sure that at the time that, we can release, we're able to release to other utilities that are in need. And so, that happens, and that worked throughout the event. And in fact, we had, I think it was almost double the number of crews that we would normally have for that type of event. But going back to the weather, as Beth indicated, the weather for that event was expected to be as bad as the blizzard of, it was 78. And that's certainly what I remember in Massachusetts that we compared to as kind of the benchmark. We've had a couple that have already hit that, but for some reason that 1978 sticks in everyone's mind.
Right.
And similarly in New York, that was a benchmark for them. And essentially it was met. I mean, what was forecast came along. The winds were significantly more elevated than were expected. Yep. And so that caused significant drifting. So Bill, you mentioned, 7 feet of snow. Yeah, that was certainly the case. And it was also it was packed so hard, it wasn't plowable in many cases, right? So you think about, you get a snowstorm, you get a bunch of plow trucks out there and they're able to clear the snow. But when it's packed that hard, you need front-end loaders to pick up and physically move that snow. And that was that was a surprise, right? We were expecting, okay, we're going to be able to plow snow around and go and do what we normally do. But, to the logistics of getting your front end loaders and being able to move that snow to be able to then go, location by location, to have tree crews come in and then line crews come in is quite the coordinated effort.
Yeah, I think another way that we were surprised was by how rapid the conditions changed. So our folks went from wearing sweatshirts to brutal cold within an hour. And when the blizzard hit, they went from having some visibility to zero visibility in a flash. And so one of the challenges that we faced is with our crews, they were still deployed. So they were still trying to work, and they're calling back to their general foremen who were staged at the storm center saying, it's getting really bad out here. And yet they were still trying to work. And so then they were given the orders to stand down where you are. And in the meantime, the blizzard hit hard then. And so they started saying, wait a second, we think we need to get to the hotels. But it was almost too late at that point. Some folks did get back to the hotels, but other folks did not get back to the hotels.
Wow. What happened to those folks? Like, what, they just had to kind of hunker down?
All of our folks ultimately got back to the hotel, but there were 2 crews that were stuck out the longest. And what happened to them is they were sitting there and they were debating, and there was a whole lot of conversations about, do they try to move or do they not try to move? They only had to go 6 miles, but it took them almost 2 hours ultimately to get 6 miles. And as their trucks started getting colder and colder on the inside, they said, we've got to make a break for it. So there was a band. The band had moved on in the snow, so they made a break and tried to get back to the hotel, and they ultimately make it. But from what I heard, crews from other vendors were stuck out. And so, the general foreman at the storm center are getting these calls from the crews saying, we're stuck. And at that point, they're trying to figure out what to do. They were trying to figure out if there was a warm place that they could walk to. And at that time, folks were still saying, call 911. We'll try to get someone out to rescue you. But in Buffalo, at that point in time, there were no rescuers coming to rescue anyone.
Yeah.
So they were stuck.
Right.
Beth mentioned, how quickly the change in weather happened. And that's something that we've been experiencing fairly much more common, not just here, but across the U.S., right? So you mentioned that you're in Texas, Tej, and you've had your share of that recently. And so what we're seeing from the impacts of climate change is making those events less predictable. I mean, we can see when they're coming, but then what's delivered is often, not in line with what can even be predicted. So when we go back to preparing for surprise, and when we did this talk back in January, we pulled in a bunch of concepts from resilience, and surprise was one of them. Yeah, how do we recognize that as much as we can prepare, there are things that are going to happen that we're not quite prepared for. So how do we flex in the moment to be able to be ready for that and adapt quickly to be able to recover? And so that climate change piece is something that's happening much more significantly. One of the models that I had shared, it's a model around uncertainty. And so one way of thinking about uncertainty is having a number of different factors and how those factors relate to each other and the rate at which those factors change. So from a utility perspective, you have the organization that goes through change over time, and that could be, workforce and the longevity of individuals, capital knowledge that the organization has. Then you have, climate change is certainly another factor. Customer perception is a factor. At one time there was, if I'm thinking back decades, right, people could be without power, and they didn't have the same sentiment that they do today, where if they're out of power for, minutes, it's when am I going to get my power back on? So that perception has changed. And then the regulatory framework and environment, that has a rate of change. So the way that these intersect with each other and how quickly creates a level of complexity. And so that climate change one, we're seeing change very quickly.
It would help, actually, Chris, for us to kind of understand, especially, in the role that you play, the organizational structure of your particular utility. Like, what do you kind of report up into? Is the being the vice president of safety, health, and assurance, like, is that organizationally into like a power delivery sort of group? Are you reporting into a corporate structure? Like, are you responsible for all utility safety? Or okay.
So my lens is we have multiple business units, and so I'm in the New England business unit and reporting up through operations. There is when we have a storm, however, we implement an incident command structure, very similar to NIMS, ICS, for those are familiar with it. So our organization will flex with whatever emergency we're being faced with, which is pretty common, I think, in most utilities and industries today. Is that it's a great framework to be able to expand or contract based on whatever the incident is. So whether it's a storm or any other type of emergency, you can use that same framework. And so safety and health, we certainly have a spot in that framework, but typically our incident commander would be someone in operations that would lead the event.
I see. Okay. Interesting. You brought up the regulatory sort of overlay as a variable, right? And, our study of the market when we look at utilities, like whether you're coming from the West Coast to the East Coast, event-driven things, wildfires, storms, whatever the case may be, whatever the utility is facing, has really impacted budgets, right? So we've seen expansion of basically utility budgets to allocate to making sure that there's enough dollars in place to prepare for these type of events, right? How have you seen that impact for you guys in your local territory? As the regulatory agencies, have they been receptive to the idea of like, holy cow, like this happened, this could happen again? Is there enough funding to support this and, the rate case, et cetera?
Yeah, so there's mechanisms in place for when a storm hits, so that we can be able to capture those costs relative to that event, and then go to the regulator and show that any costs were incurred prudently and appropriately, and be able to recover those over some period of time. So not all utilities have that. We've had them in place here in the Northeast for quite some time because you wouldn't say that it's unique to us, but with the amount of vegetation that we have up in the Northeast, it's not uncommon to have storms that impact our lines. Whereas I can't say how prevalent those mechanisms are in, say, the central part of the country, although they may be starting to get more common. The amount of storms that we have compared to others seems to, at least over the past 10 years, have been significant up here, but now we're starting to see it widespread, right? We're seeing the shifts of tornadoes from where they were. They're starting to move more towards the coast even, and wildfires landslides out in California. So generally, there's some sort of mechanism in place in advance to know how you can go about having expenditures, but again, making sure that prudently occurred to be able to seek recovery.
That's fair.
So both of you are interested in sharing with your peers from this event. What's the one or two takeaways you'd like them to, if you had to share something with peers?
Well, in my major takeaway is that more extreme storms are coming, and what we've done to prepare in the past is not enough. And so we need to prepare differently, and we can prepare differently because resilience engineering, when you start applying some of those concepts and ideas, it is a whole different way. It supplements traditional planning would probably be a better way to put it. So I think it's important that we form strong partnerships and we figure out how we can prepare differently. And when we led our workshop, we had some ideas about that. So we kind of talked about some structures that we could put in place, but I'd love to see us come together. And when I say us, I mean utilities and the contract partners, and come together and really talk about what do we need to do different. Because for us, we got lucky. And I'm just going to put that out there. We got lucky. And oddly, one reason we got lucky is because the storm went over Christmas. So our crews brought extra food, extra fuel, things like that, because it was Christmas. But if we hadn't done that, things could have been a lot worse for us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your transparency on that. Like it's, it's to kind of relate this back to like a market event sort of deal, like from trading or investing, it's, being lucky doesn't mean that you were expecting, what was going to happen. So I think it's important to recognize when you are lucky, divorce yourself from that and say, okay, like how do we implement a system, a structure, something that allows us to anticipate? And Chris, like the way you had described that, like those set of variables and all the things, rate of change, I thought was very, very interesting. It was a different way of thinking about it. I never quite thought about it that way. That was pretty interesting. Yeah.
So I have a question. I'm just thinking of opening my garage door and facing 7 feet of snow. What do you do with it? How do you get out of your garage?
So a lot of people were shut into their homes for several days. I talked to a long colleague who didn't leave their house, I think, 4 or 5 days. And
yeah,
so, it was really a problem of a community, right? It wasn't just, Beth and I talking about utility and line clearance, but there were, a lot of agencies that had to come together to help out the community in various ways. But it's true. It's, it is something that as citizens, we should all think about is what's our plan in an emergency, right? And, we always talk about having your own personal, family emergency plan. What do you do to be able to, get out of your house? What do you have to do if you have to stay in your house for a period of time? Do you have everything that you need in order to do that?
Right. It's interesting, the challenges of the past they're going to be bigger in the future, is what you're saying. And, don't always think about that.
They're going to be bigger and they're going to be faster.
Yeah.
Yeah. Before we kind of wrap up today, I know Beth, in a previous episode, we kind of dove a little bit into your background and the motivations for why you went into this space. Chris, for you, 18 years in the space, it feels like you had a bit of a deliberate path in safety, emergency response, et cetera. Was it organic, or were you like, hey, I'm fascinated by, being surrounded by events and how you tackle these type of problems, et cetera? Like, the reason I asked that question is because you've got a lot of young folks coming up, right, who are, entering the utility industry and, contractors, et cetera, and they have to pick a path. And so, is it something that people can prepare for, or is it something that once you're inside, you kind of move around and you get exposed to it more in a practical setting? Like for you, what was it, and how do you sort of help the future?
So, there's idea of you could be a technical specialist or a generalist. And at one point I thought I was going to be a technical specialist. And then I realized that I'm just a curious person by nature. Mm-hmm. And, after I kind of dive down into something and learn a bunch about it, I end up kind of in offshoots and wanting to learn more about something else. And so I made a conscious decision at one point, that I wanted to take more of a generalist type role. And, one of the things that what I mentor folks, what I share with them is, this analogy. If you're driving down the road and, you're staying in your lane and you consider that lane a technical specialist, you can only go as fast as the car that's in front of you, right? You end up
100%.
Picking up a lot of the scenery that's along the way, but sometimes you got to wait for that car in front of you to move before you can move forward. Whereas if you're more of a generalist, you get to change lanes. You can make lateral moves, and sometimes that affords you to move, advance your career quicker. So the ruling that I landed in safety, I was working in, I guess I'll give you the quick story. So I was working in finance for a long period of time and thought I would be working in finance as a technical specialist. And then that's when I decided to become more of a generalist. And so I made a decision to change my scope of work very significantly, and went into at the time, nobody knew what a business continuity plan was. And so I took on a role to implement business continuity plans. And lo and behold, 4 or 5 years later, I was implementing a pandemic plan. So during that time, or shortly after that time, I found myself getting more involved in emergency management and then in operations. I think that's about the time that I met Beth. And I found it fascinating, to understand why people make decisions the way they make. Why do they make them? But also, what drives people to make decisions? What are those external factors that system factors that influence decisions, whether people know it or not? And that led me into the world of safety and behavioral science and human organizational performance. And so that led me to where I am. So it's a long way to answer your question.
No, it's
Ed
a great.
Pish has a parallel career path.
I do.
Finance, and we're making him a veg manager now.
Yeah, exactly. My hands have been in a lot of places, but I like how you sort of articulated that. I'm more of a generalist as well. I'm curious. I like to be able to move around, and I'm agnostic to problem solving. Like, if it's a problem, I'm interested in solving it. So whether that's in discipline A, discipline B. So I've what you were saying resonates very much with me. I think as this younger population starts to come up, I'm always interested, especially as we look at this broad industry in this sector. There's so many important elements of it. But what we find sometimes as a business builder is that there's these micro shortages. You've got someone like Beth and Chris who have amassed this incredible knowledge, and they're in a position to solve very complex problems. But so much of that is based on your developed lens, and you can't just we can't just swap Chris out and put in Bill or Jane or Tom. You know what I mean? Because there's a certain responsibility and need that goes with that. So I'm always kind of curious how one prepares for that, the backfilling of those type of lenses and skills. Is it something that you have to be deliberate about, or is there enough organic people moving into those roles, that kind of thing? So
it's I go back to that model that I gave you with the different factors, and one of them is organizational change. And so, it's true as a leader. How are you? One measure of a leader is, are you developing other leaders? So you got to look across the organization and understand how can you move folks to challenge them, but also so that you can set up the organization to move forward.
Yeah, the continuity of that. Yeah, absolutely. Well, this was a super fascinating chat. Beth, Chris, really thank you very much for joining us today and kind of digging into that event. And I'm glad you guys came out of it whether it was lucky or skill or a lot of combination of many things, but it sounds like you guys handled it really, really well. And thanks for sharing some of these great insights today. This was pretty awesome. Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks.
And sorry about the Celtics dig early.
That's it's payback. I know.
Yeah, you got the Red Sox you can lean on now. So.
And Beth, great to see you. Looking
Good
forward to seeing you again soon.
Yeah, I hope so.
That's it for this episode of Trees and Lines, brought to you by Iapetus Holdings. If you like the show, please give us a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. If you have any questions or comments on any of our episodes or ideas for topics or guests, we'd love to hear from you. Please contact us at treesandlines@iapetusllc.com. We'll chat with you soon.